No one chose her until she looked at a human and asked, "Will you be my mate?" The hall smelled like incense and old politics. Dara had learned to hate that smell long before she understood why. It was the smell of ceremony, of tradition dressed in silk and pressed into a room full of people who were all watching her in the same careful sideways way, the kind of look people use when they feel sorry for someone but do not want to say so out loud. She stood at the far end of the bonding platform, which was a long stretch of polished black stone that caught the overhead lights and held them like still water. Around her, 11 other Veltari females stood in a neat row. Their bioluminescent markings pulsed in soft, confident rhythms, slow blues and warm golds that signaled readiness, hope, and quiet certainty. Dara's own markings, which ran along her neck and collarbone and down all 4 of her arms in thin rivers of pale light, had gone flat long before she arrived. They always went flat in this room. 22 cycles. That was how many times she had stood on a platform like this, or one like it. 22 bonding ceremonies on 4 different stations across 3 star systems, and she had never once been chosen. Not once. She was not considered unattractive by her species standards, or so she had been told on several occasions, which was, of course, exactly the kind of thing people said when everything else they thought was too unkind to speak aloud. She was tall, even for a Veltari female, which placed her at well over 2 meters in bare feet. Her secondary arms were longer than average, with a reach that had startled more than one person who had stood too close. Her eyes, 4 of them arranged in a soft arc across her face, were a deep amber gold that her mother had called striking and her peers had called unsettling once they were old enough to be honest. She spoke too quickly. She had strong opinions about military history and galactic policy that she shared without being asked. She had once corrected a High Elder's translation of a ceremonial text in front of a dinner table full of dignitaries, and she had been completely right about it, which had somehow made the situation worse rather than better. She was, as the formal rejection communications had expressed over the years in the careful language of diplomacy, a complicated match. She stood straight anyway. She had always stood straight. It was the one thing no ceremony could take from her. The hall was enormous, built in the old Veltari style with high vaulted ceilings and walls of layered pale stone that had been transported from their home system at considerable expense. Station Vareth had been neutral ground for 12 species for over 300 years, and its bonding hall was considered sacred by most of them, though for different reasons and in different ways depending on who you asked. Dignitaries from 7 systems occupied the tiered seating above the platform. Merchants, diplomats, and minor nobility filled the rows below. Everyone wore their ceremonial best. Everyone was watching. Dara scanned the room the way she always did, not with hope, but with the measured, cataloging attention of someone who trained herself out of hope years ago, because hope has a price, and she had paid it too many times. She noted the Greth ambassador's box sitting empty, which was unusual enough to be worth remembering. She noted the updated security configuration at the east entrance, which meant command had rotated the station watch without informing the ceremony coordinators. She noted, with a small detached interest, that the flower arrangements near the central column were the wrong shade of blue for a 3rd cycle bonding ceremony, and she briefly wondered whether the decorator had made the mistake on purpose or by carelessness. And then she noticed the human. He had come in through the east entrance, which explained the security irregularity, because someone had clearly waved him through without verifying that he had any idea where he was going. He was of medium height for his species, which placed him at roughly her shoulder. His dark hair had not been cut recently. His uniform was the correct one for a station security liaison, but it had visibly been slept in at some point within the last day. He was holding something small and wrapped in silver foil that he was eating with the quiet, slightly self-conscious concentration of someone who had skipped a proper meal and was hoping the room would not notice. The room noticed. He noticed the room at approximately the same moment. To his credit, He did not run. He stopped walking and took in the scene with an expression that moved through several clear phases in about 2 seconds. Confusion, embarrassment, the particular horror of someone who has stepped through the wrong door at the worst possible time, and then something else. Something that was not panic, something steadier. He looked around the platform. He looked at the dignitaries. He looked at the 11 Veltari females on his left, who were now regarding him with expressions ranging from alarm to offense. And then he looked at Dara. Not past her. Not through her. At her. He had light brown eyes. Calm ones. Not searching her face for a category to place her in. Not calculating whether she was a threat or an inconvenience or something to be carefully managed. Just looking, the way a person looks at something they have not seen before and find genuinely worth looking at. He lifted the foil-wrapped meal in a small, apologetic gesture, the kind that said he understood he had walked into something important, and that he was sorry for the interruption, and that he did not entirely understand what was happening, but was willing to. Something moved inside Dara's chest, not the romantic warmth that ceremonies like this were built to produce. She had stopped waiting for that feeling, somewhere around cycle 12. This was older than that, and quieter. The specific internal shift of a person who has been looked past so many times and for so long that being truly seen, even briefly and accidentally, by a stranger holding a snack in the wrong room, lands in a place you did not know was still open. The elder at the head of the platform cleared her throat, a sound like a small, polished stone dropped onto glass. The ceremony was waiting. Protocol required that Dara turn her gaze back to the assembled hall, stand correctly, and be considered, and gently passed over again, with whatever dignity 22 cycles of practice could provide. She looked at the elder. She looked at the platform. She looked at the 11 women beside her, whose markings burned with confident color, and she thought about how every single one of them would be claimed before the evening was over, and she would ride the transit back to her quarters alone, as she always did, and tell herself it did not matter. She looked at the human again. He still had not moved. He was still standing just inside the east entrance with his foil-wrapped meal and his calm, unguarded eyes, and he was watching her with an expression she would spend a long time after that day trying to put into words. It was not pity. It was not the complicated sideways appraisal she had grown used to receiving. It was closer to curiosity. The open, unhurried curiosity of a person who has seen something unexpected and is deciding what to make of it without having already decided. Dara thought about 22 cycles. She thought about the form rejections and the careful language and the flower arrangements in the wrong shade of blue and the smell of incense that she had never once learned to tolerate. She stepped off the platform. The sound that passed through the hall was not quite a gasp. It was something closer to the sound of 400 people discovering they had all stopped breathing at precisely the same moment. Dara walked the length of the ceremonial floor in a silence so complete she could hear the soft sound her feet made against the polished black stone. She did not walk quickly or slowly. She walked exactly as she always walked, straight-backed, deliberate, occupying the full amount of space she was entitled to, and the room parted for her attention, the way rooms always did when a Veltari female, in full ceremonial dress, decided to cross them with purpose. She stopped in front of the human. He was looking up at her now, because she was considerably taller, and his expression had settled into something she found she could not entirely read, which was unusual. She could generally read people. He was surprised, that was clear, but not alarmed. His eyes were still steady. There was something in them that was tipping, slowly and without rushing, toward interested. She was aware of the entire hall watching. She was aware of the elder behind her who had not yet exhaled. She was aware that she was doing something without precedent in recorded Veltari ceremonial history, and that the consequences of this moment would follow her regardless of what happened next, regardless of what he said. She had 400 pairs of eyes on her back, and one pair directly in front of her, and the one pair in front of her was the only one that was not making her feel like a problem to be solved. she said, in his language, which she had learned 3 cycles ago for reasons she had never let herself examine too honestly. I apologize for interrupting whatever you thought you were walking into. The human blinked. His mouth opened slightly, closed again. But I have a question, she continued. All right, he said. His voice was lower than she had expected, steadier than anyone had a right to be in that moment. Dara looked at him. She did not let herself hesitate, because if she hesitated she would think, and if she thought she would hear the 22 cycles of careful internal reasoning that had always talked her out of exactly this kind of moment. "Will you be my mate?" she asked. The silence in the hall became a different kind of silence. Not just the absence of sound, but the presence of something heavier, the collective held breath of everyone in the room processing a thing they had not prepared for and could not immediately categorize. In the upper tier, something fell. A ceremonial fan, Dara thought, from the soft sound it made hitting the stone floor. Nobody moved to retrieve it. The human looked at her for a moment that stretched longer than it should have. Then he looked at the room. Then he looked back at her. "Can you tell me," he said, very carefully and without any panic in his voice at all, "what that means? Specifically, for your species." Behind her, one of the high elders made a sound that was either a cough or the beginning of a much longer conversation. And Dara's markings, which had been flat and pale all evening, flared. Not gold, not blue. Something warmer than either of those. Something she did not have a name for yet, but that her body apparently knew before her mind did. She thought, "I do not know what happens next." And then, for the first time in 22 cycles, that thought did not frighten her. "My name is Marcus Cole, and I want to be very clear that none of what happened that evening was my fault. I had been assigned to Station Varath 6 weeks earlier as a trade route security liaison, which is a title that sounds more impressive than the job actually is. In practical terms, it meant I verified cargo manifests, ran background checks on visiting merchant crews, attended a lot of meetings where people argued about docking fees, and filed reports that nobody read. It was not exciting work. I was not an exciting person. I was 29 years old. I ate too many meal bars because the station cafeteria closed before my shift ended, and my most significant achievement in the past year had been successfully renegotiating a parts contract that saved the station approximately 40,000 credits, which my supervisor had noted in my file without promotion. I had been looking for Bay Corridor 7. There was a shipment of calibration equipment that had come in 2 hours late, and the manifest numbers were not matching, and I needed to physically verify the crates before I could close the incident report. The directions I had been given were wrong. I say this with complete confidence because I am good at directions, and I did not make a mistake. Someone had incorrectly labeled the corridor junctions on the east side of the station, and that was how I ended up walking through a door marked with a symbol I did not recognize into what turned out to be the most important room I had ever accidentally entered in my life. The first thing I noticed was the smell. Incense of some kind, warm and heavy, with something underneath it that was floral but not quite like any flower I knew. The second thing I noticed was the silence. The immediate, pressing silence of a room full of people who had all just noticed me at the same moment. The third thing I noticed was her. She was standing apart from a row of other tall, luminous beings at the end of a long black stone platform, and she was looking at me with 4 amber eyes that had the quality of searchlights that had decided, independently of their owner, to find something worth illuminating. She was the tallest person in a room full of people who were all very tall. She had 4 arms, each one carrying that same pale bioluminescent light that the others had, except hers was dimmer, quieter, like a lamp that had been turned down so many times it was running on memory more than power. I looked at her. I am not sure what I expected to feel in that moment. Probably fear, or at minimum the general alarm of someone who has walked into an obviously sacred ceremony he has no business being in. But what I actually felt, standing in the doorway of that hall with 400 eyes on me and one pair of amber ones holding steady above all the rest, was something much simpler. I was curious. She was watching me in a way that nobody in the room was watching me. Everyone else was alarmed, or offended, or performing the careful blank expression of someone who is very offended but considers it beneath them to show it. She was watching me the way a person watches something unexpected that they have not yet decided what to think about. I lifted my meal bar in a small apology and stayed where I was, because moving in either direction felt like it would make things worse. Then she stepped off the platform. The room made a sound I had no vocabulary for at the time. I know now that it was the sound of a Velthari bonding ceremony experiencing something that had not happened in its recorded history, but in that moment it was simply a sound that made the back of my neck feel cold. She walked toward me. She walked the way she stood, without apology, without hesitation, taking up the full space of the corridor she was moving through with a kind of deliberate, almost architectural straightness. She was not walking at me the way someone walks at you when they are annoyed. She was walking at me the way someone moves toward a fixed point they have decided on. She stopped close enough that I had to tilt my head back to meet her eyes. She said, in my language, with an accent that was careful and precise in the way that suggests someone who has studied rather than simply acquired, "I apologize for interrupting whatever you thought you were walking into." I said that's all right, because it seemed like the right thing to say and because I was buying myself time. "But I have a question," she said. "All right," I said, and she asked me if I would be her mate. I will be honest with you. My first thought was that I had misunderstood her, because the sentence she had said was a sentence that did not belong in the moment I was currently occupying. I was holding a protein bar in a doorway at what I had believed until 60 seconds ago was a cargo inspection gone slightly wrong. You do not expect marriage proposals in those circumstances. My second thought was that I needed more information before I could respond with any kind of integrity. I said, "Can you tell me what that means, specifically, for your species?" The room reacted to that in a way I did not fully understand at the time. I heard a sound from somewhere behind her that suggested someone of authority had just lost their composure. I saw, in my peripheral vision, several dignitaries in the upper level leaning toward each other with expressions that ranged from scandalized to fascinated. She, however, looked at me differently. It was a very small change, easy to miss if you were not already looking closely. Something in the set of her expression shifted, some tightness I had not consciously registered until it began to release. She tilted her head slightly to one side, and the pale light along her neck and arms flickered. Not brighter exactly, more present. "You are asking for a definition," she said, before answering. "It seems like relevant information," I said. "Yes," she said. "It is." Her name was Dara. I learned that in the next 5 minutes, standing in the doorway of the bonding hall while 400 beings watched us, and a very controlled-looking Veltari elder waited on the platform behind her with the expression of someone exercising extraordinary patience. Dara told me, in precise and measured sentences, that a Veltari bonding was a permanent partnership of equals, that it involved a series of ceremonial trials, that it was taken seriously by her people in a way that very few other things were, that she was asking me not because she had run out of options. She said this with a flat, direct quality that suggested she wanted no ambiguity on the point, but because I had walked into a room and looked at her without doing the thing that apparently everyone else in her life did when they looked at her. "What do they do?" I asked. "They calculate," she said. "They see me, and they immediately begin working out whether I am worth the complication." "And I didn't do that?" "You looked," she said. "Just looked. You did not calculate anything." I could see it. I thought about that. I thought about how accurate it was, actually. I had not been calculating anything, partly because the situation had moved too fast for calculation, and partly because the person in front of me had not presented as a problem to be solved. I said, "I'm flattered. I'm also genuinely confused, and I'm probably violating 6 different regulations just by having this conversation in this location." "Likely," she agreed. She said it without apology, which I respected. "I'm not saying no," I said, because that was the honest thing, and because I had looked at her long enough by that point to know that dishonesty would not serve either of us. She was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that has weight in it. "You are asking for time," she said. "I'm asking for a conversation," I said, "a real one, not in front of 400 people." Something happened in her expression that I still find difficult to accurately describe. It was not happiness exactly. It was the look of a person who has been asking for something simple for a very long time and has finally been offered it in the exact form they needed, without having to explain what form that was. "Yes," she said, "that is acceptable." The walk back out of the hall was the longest walk I had ever taken. I was aware of every eye in that room following us, me leading slightly because the door was on my side, her following at that straight-backed, unhurried pace, and I was aware that whatever had just happened was going to have consequences I could not yet map. My security training told me that any situation that generated this much attention required careful management. The rest of me, which was more honest than my training, told me that I had just done something right for the first time in a while and that I should not overthink it. The memo arrived before I reached my quarters. It was from Commander Reeve at the station's Earth Liaison Office, and it read, "Sergeant Cole, it has been brought to our attention that you attended the Veltari bonding ceremony this evening in an unofficial capacity and engaged in conduct that may have diplomatic implications. Please report at 0800 for a full debrief. This has been flagged to Regional Command." I read it twice. Then I put my communicator face down on my bunk and finished my protein bar. The conversation with Dara happened 3 days later, in one of the station's common lounges on the outer ring where the view was a wide sweep of stars and the docking lights of 40 different ships. She arrived exactly on time, which I had expected. She sat across from me with the composure of someone who had spent years learning to make composure look effortless. I had spent those 3 days learning as much as I could about Veltari bonding customs, which was how I knew that what she had done, approaching a potential mate rather than waiting to be approached, and doing so at a public ceremony, was genuinely unprecedented. Not technically prohibited, apparently. Just something that had never been done, because the social weight of it was considerable, and the possibility of rejection in that context was the kind of risk that her culture did not build its people to take. "You knew what you were doing," I said, when we had been sitting long enough for the silence to be comfortable. "At the ceremony, you knew the risk." "Yes," she said. "Why?" She looked at me for a moment. Not the calculating look I was used to receiving from beings trying to determine my threat level or my diplomatic usefulness. Just a look, patient and direct, and a little tired around the edges, in the way of someone who has been tired for a long time. "Because I decided," she said, "that the risk of doing it was less than the cost of not doing it, and because you had honest eyes." "Honest eyes," I said. "You were embarrassed to be in the wrong room," she said, "but you were not embarrassed to be seen. Most people, when they are caught somewhere unexpected, immediately begin performing. You did not perform. You just looked." I thought about that for a while. "I was too confused to perform," I admitted. "I know," she said. "That is part of what made it convincing." I looked at her across the table. She was remarkable. And I do not use that word carelessly, not because of how she looked, though her appearance was striking in every technical sense, the height and the 4 arms, and the amber eyes, and the bioluminescent markings that had been moving through a slow, warm pattern since she sat down. She was remarkable because she had done something that required a kind of nerve I had not expected to find in this station. in this lounge, in this conversation that I had walked into by accident and was increasingly glad I had not walked out of. "The 12 trials," I said. "Tell me about them." Something in her posture relaxed, very slightly. "You have been researching," she said. "I'm a security liaison," I said. "Information is the job." "The trials," she said, "are designed to assess whether a potential mate has the qualities the bonding requires. Intelligence, courage, adaptability, they are not physical challenges, they are tests of how a person thinks under pressure. And if I fail them? Then the bonding does not proceed," she said, "with no dishonor to either party. The trials exist to protect both people, not to embarrass one of them." I nodded. I was thinking about Regional Command and Commander Reeve and the memo that I had not yet replied to. I said, "I have a supervisor who is going to have a very strong opinion about this. I have an elder council that has already sent 4 communications to my family," she said. "Since the ceremony. What do they say?" "They are concerned," she said, in a tone that suggested they were considerably more than concerned, and that she had read all 4 communications with the focused attention of someone taking notes on the opposition. I said, "Are you?" She looked at me. The markings on her arms moved in a long, slow pulse. "I am determined," she said. "Those are different things." I thought, "Yes, they are." I thought, "I am not sure what I am walking into." I thought, "I was not sure about anything I have walked into today, and the ones I walked into by accident turned out to be the most interesting ones." I said, "Tell me where the first trial is." And for the first time since I had met her, Dara smiled. The first trial was held in the Hall of Questions on the station's administrative level, and it was, according to every piece of documentation Dara had found, supposed to take 40 minutes. It took 3 days. Not because Marcus was slow, because he was wrong in a way that nobody could stop arguing about. Dara had explained the structure to him the evening before. The riddle of tides was the oldest of the 12 trials, used by the Velthari for over 400 years. It was a philosophical question with a correct answer. The answer had been established by the first High Council and had not changed. You were expected to arrive at it through structured reasoning, demonstrating that your mind worked in the orderly, systematic way that made for a stable partner and a competent presence in a long-term bond. Marcus had arrived at the correct starting point. He had identified the right premises, and then, somewhere in the 3rd stage of his reasoning, he had turned in a direction that no one had ever turned before and arrived at an answer that was technically different from the established one, but that 3 of the 5 elder judges could not immediately prove was wrong. The other 2 said nothing and looked at each other with expressions that Dara had learned to read over 22 years of ceremony attendance. They were the expressions of beings who needed to consult privately before committing to an official position. The hall was recessed for the day. Then the next day. Then the morning of the day after that. Dara sat in the corridor outside the deliberation chamber with her back straight and her secondary arms folded and her primary arms resting in her lap with a patience she had cultivated over years of practice. Around her, the station went about its business. Cargo crews and diplomats and maintenance workers moving through the corridor with the particular purposeful energy of people who had somewhere to be and were going there. Marcus came and sat next to her on the 3rd morning, carrying 2 cups of something hot that he had gotten from the cafeteria. He held one out to her. "They are still arguing," she said. "I know," he said. "I can hear them from the corridor." "You gave an incorrect answer," she said. "I gave a different answer," he said. "Different isn't the same as wrong. For this trial it may be. Then let them prove it." He drank from his cup. "My answer isn't wrong. It's just not the one they were expecting." Dara looked at him. She had been trying to read him since the ceremony, the way she read everyone, mapping the gap between what they said and what their body communicated, finding the points of pressure and the points of ease. Marcus was difficult to read in the usual way because his manner of presentation was unusually consistent. He said what he meant. When he did not say something, it was because he had not yet decided, not because he was concealing. She had met very few beings in her life about whom that was true. "You are not worried," she said. "I'm a little worried," he said, "but I believe my reasoning was sound. Worrying more won't change whether it was or not. Most people facing an elder review would be considerably more worried. Most people haven't been through a supply chain audit with Commander Reeve," he said. "After that, elder reviews feel manageable." She looked at him for a long moment. He was watching the corridor traffic with that calm, interested gaze she had noticed first in the ceremony hall, the gaze of a person who finds most things genuinely worth paying attention to, which was rarer than it should have been. "The council wrote to my sister," Dara said. He turned to look at her. "Saying what?" "Saying that I have made a choice that reflects poor judgment and will bring difficulty on our family." She said it in the same tone she used for cargo manifests, flat and informational. "That a human bond partner is socially inadvisable, that my years without a match have made me desperate." Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What did your sister say back?" "She said that they should mind their own affairs, and that she supported whatever I decided." A pause. "She also said that if I was going to do something unconventional, she was glad I had at least done it publicly, so that the family could not be accused of hiding it." He made a sound that was almost a laugh. "I like your sister." "She is difficult and extremely loyal," Dara said. "She is my favorite person." "Second favorite," he said, without looking at her. Dara processed that for a moment. She felt the warm flicker in her markings, before she could prevent it. The deliberation chamber doors opened on the morning of the fourth day, and the elder panel delivered their finding. The human's reasoning was unconventional, but not demonstrably incorrect, and the trial result would be logged as completed under the provision that allowed for novel interpretive approaches. Elder Voss dissented. The written record of the dissent was 17 pages long, according to the administrative clerk, who sent Dara the summary. Marcus read the summary and said, 17 pages. "You challenged 400 years of established academic consensus," Dara said. "I answered a question," he said, honestly. "Do you understand that the other 4 judges will have told the story of your reasoning to every person they know by the end of the week?" He looked uncertain for the first time. "Is that bad?" "It means," she said carefully, "that you are being discussed, in rooms where the relevant people talk. Good discussion or bad discussion?" "Both," she said, loudly. He considered this. Then he said, "I'll take it." The second trial required him to demonstrate adaptability under conditions of uncertainty. In practice, this meant he was placed in a room with a malfunctioning atmospheric regulator, a toolkit he had not seen before, and a time limit that was not disclosed to him. He fixed the regulator in 11 minutes using a method that the equipment's original designers had not included in any manual, which Dara knew because she had read every manual. He used a piece of tubing repurposed from a ventilation panel and a connector borrowed from a wall terminal that was technically not supposed to be removable. The elder observer for that trial was a composed and experienced woman named High Overseer Pellin, who had administered the second trial for 30 years and had never once seen it completed in under 20 minutes. She sent Dara a formal note afterward that said simply, "He is resourceful." Dara sent back, "Yes." The third trial was a test of memory and ethical reasoning, conducted as a long scenario presented verbally in which the subject was required to identify the correct action in a situation where no option was clearly right. Most candidates spent 40 minutes on it. Marcus spent 22, and then asked a follow-up question about the scenario that the presenting elder admitted he had never considered, which led to a further hour-long conversation that technically fell outside the trial parameters, but that neither of them ended voluntarily. Dara heard about this from the presenting elder, who sought her out afterward with an expression she had difficulty classifying. He said, "Your human asks unusual questions." "Yes," she said. Not rhetorical ones. He actually wants the answers. I know, she said. It is, the elder said, after a brief pause, rather refreshing. Between trials, the station hummed with conversation. Dara was not naive enough to believe that most of it was kind. She passed through the market corridor on the fourth day and heard two Veltari merchants talking behind her in the careful, lowered voices of people who wanted to be overheard. The words they used were not subtle. The substance was familiar. She had made a desperate choice, they said. She had embarrassed herself. A human mate was a social liability, a curiosity, something to be pitied. She stopped walking. The merchants noticed. One of them had the sense to fall quiet. The other one, who was apparently committed to his position, met her eyes with the slightly elevated chin of someone who believes their social position protects them from consequences. Dara said, in the even, precise tone she had spent years perfecting, "I have been passed over 22 times, Merchant Orel. The difference between you and me is that I know exactly why, and you have never been honest enough with yourself to examine the same question about your own choices. I am choosing well. I suggest you spend less time discussing my affairs and more time reviewing your own." She walked on. Behind her, the merchant made no further comments. She did not turn around. Marcus heard about the exchange from the docking supervisor, who had been standing nearby, and came to find her that evening in the outer ring lounge. He sat across from her and looked at her with that steady, direct gaze and said, "You didn't have to defend this to anyone." "I am not defending it," she said. "I am simply declining to be discussed as though I am not present." "There's a difference." "A large one." He nodded. He was quiet for a moment, in the comfortable way he had, where the silence was not empty, but was simply the space between one thought and the next. "People at my station are talking too," he said. "My colleagues, my supervisors. The official line from command is that I've created a diplomatic complication and should handle it with appropriate sensitivity." "And your unofficial position?" "Is that I ate a meal bar in the wrong corridor and met someone remarkable," he said, "and that the rest of it is bureaucratic noise." Dara looked at him. The markings along her arms were doing the warm, slow pulse again, the one she had not been able to entirely control since the first evening. She was not used to that. The loss of control over her own bioluminescence was something that happened to young people, to people in the first stages of a strong feeling, not to someone who had spent 22 cycles building a careful, disciplined composure. "Marcus," she said. "Yes? I want to tell you something that I did not include in the ceremonial explanation because it was not relevant at the time, but which I believe you should know now." He set down his cup. His attention was fully on her in the way she was beginning to understand was simply how he listened, completely, without dividing it. "I have been afraid," she said, "for most of my adult life, not of the ceremony or the rejection, though those were painful. Afraid of the wanting, afraid that wanting something so much and for so long meant that I had become smaller than I was meant to be, that the wanting had made me less." He said nothing. She continued, "I did not ask you at the ceremony because I was desperate. I asked because when you looked at me, I felt the wanting again, the clean, honest version of it, the one I had before it became something complicated, and for the first time in a very long time, I thought that feeling, it might be safe." Marcus was quiet for long enough that she began to wish she had said less. Then he said, "I'm not going to let you become less, for the record." "You cannot promise that," she said. "You have known me 11 days. 11 days is long enough to know how someone listens," he said. "And how they stand, and what they do when someone is unkind to them in a market corridor." He picked up his cup again. "You didn't become less just now. You became more. You've been becoming more every day since the ceremony. I've been watching." Dara's markings flared. Not the slow, warm pulse, but something brighter and faster. The color her species called the bloom of beginning, which was supposed to be an involuntary response to a significant emotional event, and which she had last experienced when she was 17 years old. She pressed her primary hand against her collarbone in a gesture she recognized, too late, as obvious. Marcus looked at the light coming through her fingers with an expression of genuine wonder, uncomplicated, unguarded wonder, the way a person looks at something they find beautiful and have not yet thought to pretend otherwise. "Does that hurt?" he asked. "No," she said. "It is involuntary." "It's beautiful," he said, as simply as if he were noting the weather. She did not have an answer for that. She was not sure one was needed. They sat in the outer ring lounge for another 2 hours, while the station moved around them and the stars outside the viewport held their patient, indifferent distances, and the conversation between them found the particular rhythm of two people who have discovered that talking to each other is easy in a way that talking to most people is not. They talked about her military history research and his cargo manifest work and the things they both found interesting and the things they did not. They talked about her sister and his older brother, who ran a boat repair shop on a coastal planet and had already sent Marcus 3 messages asking for an explanation of recent events. They did not talk about the 12 trials, or the Elder Council, or the memo from Regional Command, or the conversations happening in corridors and market stalls across the station. They did not need to. When Dara finally stood to leave, she stood in the way she always stood, straight and unhurried and taking up her full amount of space. Marcus stood with her, which was something he always did without being asked, and she had noticed it every time. "4th trial," she said, "day after tomorrow. The elder observer will ask you a series of questions with no correct answers. The purpose is to observe how you reason, not what conclusions you reach." "Good," he said. "I'm better at reasoning than conclusions." "I know," she said. She walked toward the corridor exit. "Dara," he said. She stopped. "Thank you for telling me," he said, "what you told me." She did not turn around. She was not entirely sure, in that moment, that she could keep her expression as composed as she needed it to be, and her markings were already warm enough without adding to it. "Good night, Marcus," she said. She walked home, through the station's quiet corridors, and felt, for the first time in 22 cycles, like someone walking towards something rather than away from it. The 4th trial was the one Marcus later described as the conversation that nearly broke my brain, and he said it with the particular affection of someone who had enjoyed every minute of the challenge. Elder Tesfan was the oldest sitting member of the council, and also, according to every person Dara had consulted, the most intellectually precise. She had been administering the 4th trial for 50 years. She had, in that time, identified the fundamental character of every candidate who sat across from her within the first 10 minutes, and she had never once been wrong about her assessments. The trial lasted 4 hours. Dara waited in the corridor outside the chamber, doing what she did best, which was sitting straight and still and being patient. She had brought a text with her this time, a monograph on early Veltari expansion policy that she had been meaning to finish for 3 months, and she read it with genuine concentration while the station moved around her and the chamber behind the door maintained its composed, formal silence. She heard voices occasionally, Marcus's, which she had learned to recognize by its particular quality of engaged, unhurried speech. The elder's, which was precise and slightly amused in the way of someone who is hearing something worth hearing. The door opened. Elder Tesfan came through first. She was small and silver-marked, and carried herself with the absolute economy of motion of a being who had long ago stopped wasting any of it. She looked at Dara the way she had always looked at Dara, directly, without the sideways calculation, and said, "He argues well." "I know," Dara said. "He also concedes well," Tesfan said, "when he is actually wrong, which is not as often as his confidence might suggest. He acknowledges it immediately and adjusts. That is rarer than the arguing." "Yes," Dara said. Tesfan looked at her for a moment with the expression of a very experienced being who has seen many things and arrived at a view about this particular one. "You chose more carefully than they think," she said, and walked on down the corridor. Marcus came through the door 30 seconds later. He looked energized in the specific way he looked energized after intellectual challenges, focused and slightly disheveled, as though his mind had been moving faster than his appearance could keep up with. He saw Dara and came to stand beside her. "She told me I reason like someone who learned everything the hard way and retained all of it," he said. "That is high praise from Tesfan," Dara said. "I figured," he said. She didn't smile when she said it, but her eyes did. Dara folded her monograph. "4 more trials," she said. "Tell me about the next one." She told him, walking side by side through the corridor toward the outer ring, their reflections moving in the polished station walls beside them, her tall and bright-marked, him a half-head shorter and steady in the way that she was beginning to understand was simply his nature, a quality that ran through him the way the bioluminescence ran through her, something produced by the body rather than decided by the mind. 5 more weeks passed, in the pattern the trials created, and in those 5 weeks, the station shifted around them in ways that Dara tracked with the careful attention she gave to any changing strategic situation. The Elder Council's communications to her family became less frequent, which meant either that they were satisfied or that they had decided the situation was established enough that objection was no longer a useful expenditure of energy. Either outcome was acceptable. The merchant Oral crossed to the other side of the corridor when he saw her coming, which she considered a reasonable resolution. Commander Reeve at the Human Liaison Office sent Marcus 3 more formal memos and 1 informal message that Marcus showed her, which said, "I don't know what you're doing, Cole, but nobody's filed a complaint. Keep it clean." She found, as the weeks moved and the trials accumulated, that she had stopped counting the ways it might not work and started counting the ways it already was. This was new. This was something she had not allowed herself in a very long time. She was not sure, yet, what to do with it. But she was learning. The Greth Sovereignty announced the blockade at 0400 station time, which meant I was asleep when it started and running at a controlled sprint through the administrative corridor when I understood what it meant. The alert system had a specific tone for weapons-grade events. I had heard it in drills twice and in an actual incident once, 3 years earlier during a cargo dispute that had escalated badly before cooler heads resolved it. This time, when I reached the operations center and saw the tactical display, cooler heads were not immediately visible. 12 Greth warships had positioned themselves at 3 of the station's 4 main approach corridors, not close enough to constitute an active engagement under intersystem law, close enough to make it impossible for any arriving supply ships to dock without passing through a corridor that the Greth could close at their discretion. It was a classic starve and negotiate posture, the kind of move that works when you do it slowly and publicly enough that the target population applies internal pressure for a settlement before the material shortages become critical. The Greth Sovereignty wanted 3 things: expanded trade rights through the Vareth corridor, a renegotiation of the station's neutral ground charter that would give them preferred access status, and the removal of 2 Veltari diplomatic observers from their territory. The last item was the one that had teeth, because the Veltari were one of the station's primary administrative partners, and remove our observers translated in practical terms to pick a side. The station council went into emergency session. I attended as the ranking Earth liaison officer, which made me technically the most senior human present despite the fact that my actual job was cargo verification. Commander Reeve was off station at a quarterly review and was currently 3 hours of travel time away. I had been in contact with her twice since the alert, and both times she had said the same thing: hold position, gather intelligence, do not commit to anything without authorization. The council meeting lasted 6 hours. In that time, the Greth warships did not move. Neither did the supply convoy that had been expected to arrive that morning, which had diverted to a holding position 40,000 kilometers out and was sending increasingly anxious status queries to the station. Dara was at the council table. She was there not as a bonding trial candidate or as a station visitor, but as what she actually was, which was a qualified military scholar with 3 decades of published research on intersystem conflict strategy and more detailed knowledge of the Greth sovereignty's historical engagement patterns than anyone else in the room. She had been invited to the session by Elder Tesfan, who had the practical wisdom to recognize what expertise was available and use it. She sat across the table from me, and she was the most composed person in the room by a considerable margin, which, given that the room included 2 senior diplomatic officials who had presumably seen crises before, said something. I was watching the tactical display on the wall while the council debated. The Greth formation was mathematically clean, I will give them that. 12 ships at 3 approach corridors, positioned with precise spacing that allowed for overlapping coverage, no gap in their perimeter that a standard vessel could navigate without entering their effective range. The station's defense response team was running projection models and coming up with the same answer each time. Any attempt to break the blockade from inside would result in an exchange that the station would not come out of in working condition. The council began moving toward settlement calculations, which meant working out what combination of the Greth's demands could be met without creating a precedent that would invite similar maneuvers from other parties in the future. It was a rational response. It was also, from everything I knew about the Greth sovereignty's operational history, going to result in a settlement that they would test again within 3 years. I was looking at the formation on the display. I had been looking at it for about 40 minutes, and I was seeing something. I had read, during a very boring 3-week assignment on a transit station 4 years earlier, every documented account of naval siege tactics from human history that I could access. Not for any professional reason, because the station library had a good historical archive and I had run out of other things to read. Among those accounts was a detailed study of a specific engagement in an ocean war on Earth, several centuries earlier, where a significantly outmatched fleet had defeated a superior force by exploiting a geometric blind spot in the opponent's formation, a gap that existed because the formation was optimized for blocking known approach vectors and had not accounted for a route that existed but was considered impractical. The Greth formation had the same gap, not at the approach corridors, between them, at an angle to the 3rd corridor that placed a vessel outside the optimal firing solutions of both the ships covering Corridor 3 and the ships covering Corridor 1, while also being inside the boundary of the station's own defensive perimeter, where Greth ships could not move without triggering an engagement they had not declared. The gap was the size of 2 frigates. Station Varath had 3. I said, I see something in the formation. The council chamber went quiet, in the way rooms go quiet when someone unexpected speaks. Elder Tesfan looked at me. Dara looked at me. The Defense Response Coordinator, a woman named Lieutenant Harlow, who I had worked with on 3 cargo incidents and who had excellent professional instincts, looked at the display and then back at me. I said, there is an approach angle between corridors 1 and 3 that falls outside their optimal firing solutions. It's a narrow window, but it's inside our own defensive boundary, which means they cannot move to cover it without crossing a line they cannot cross publicly under the current engagement parameters. Silence. The defense coordinator pulled the display forward and ran a geometry calculation. The result appeared in about 15 seconds. She looked at it. She looked at me. She looked at the display again. That is correct, she said, with the careful expression of someone who has just found something they are not sure they should have found. That gap exists. Dara said, what is your proposal? I laid it out. Send 2 of the 3 frigates through the gap on a trajectory that kept them within the defensive boundary while moving to bracket the 3rd approach corridor from inside. Not an aggressive posture, a positioning move, one that could be described in any subsequent communication as a routine internal patrol, but a positioning move that, once complete, would give the station a presence that complicated the Greth formation's clean geometry. A move that said, "We see your structure, and we have adjusted ours, and the mathematics are no longer entirely in your favor." The council's response was not immediate enthusiasm. The senior diplomatic official said the risk of misinterpretation was too high. The External Affairs Coordinator said that acting without formal authorization from the Charter Council would set a problematic precedent. 3 other members said variations of the same thing, which was that the plan was too aggressive and too untested and required more review time than they currently had. I knew they were not entirely wrong. It was a bold move. If the Greth chose to interpret it as a hostile act, things could become significantly worse very quickly. I had run that possibility in my head repeatedly during the 40 minutes I had been studying the formation, and I had not been able to definitively rule it out. Dara stood up. The room, which had been building to a conversation that would have continued for several more hours and arrived at a settlement offer, went quiet. "I am invoking the champion's right," she said. I learned later that the champion's right was an ancient provision in Velthari emergency law, rarely invoked and even more rarely applicable, which allowed a Velthari citizen in the process of a formal bonding, at any point between the question and the final answer, to claim temporary co-command authority in a military or strategic emergency when the standard chain of decision was producing an outcome that the citizen assessed as critically inadequate. The provision required that the champion act jointly with their chosen mate, which meant that for the next 48 hours, Dara and I had command authority over the station's defense response. Elder Tesfan, who had known this provision existed and had clearly seen where the conversation was going, said nothing. She simply stepped back from the table. The defense coordinator looked at Dara for a long moment, then at me, then at the display, and said, "The order requires your joint authorization. Both of you." I looked at Dara. She was already looking at me. "Do you understand what you are doing?" I asked her, quietly enough that only she could hear it clearly. "Yes," she said. "Do you trust your analysis?" I thought about the gap. I thought about the documentation I had read on the transit station during a boring assignment that had never felt boring to me in the moment, because everything was worth paying attention to. I thought about the formation geometry and the math the defense coordinator had confirmed, and the 40 minutes of looking at a problem from an angle that everyone else in the room had been too experienced to consider. "Yes," I said. "Then we are doing it," she said. We authorized the order together. The 2 frigates moved. The next 4 hours were the longest of my life. I watched the tactical display from the operations center, with Dara standing beside me, both of us still and quiet in our different ways, while the station's defense team executed the maneuver with a clean, professional precision that I will never forget, because it was the first time in my career that something I had theorized had become something that was actually happening in real space. The Greth ships reacted, not with weapons fire, with a formation adjustment, a lateral shift of the 3 ships covering Corridor 1 to respond to the new geometry, which created a secondary gap in their coverage of Corridor 2, which the station's 3rd frigate was already positioned to exploit. It took 11 minutes for the Greth lead vessel to open a communication channel. It took another 2 hours to negotiate the terms of a withdrawal. The settlement they accepted was significantly less than what the Council had been preparing to offer. No trade concessions. A minor adjustment to docking scheduling that cost the station nothing meaningful. The Veltari observers remained exactly where they were. When the last Greth ship cleared the approach corridors and the supply convoy was cleared to proceed to dock, the operations center was silent for about 5 seconds. Then someone started clapping. Then several people started clapping. Then the room was clapping, and I was standing in the middle of it, covered in the various residues of 6 hours in an emergency operations center, cold coffee, and the particular smell of recycled air, and the slightly chemical undertone of a room where people have been stressed for a long time. And Dara was beside me, and she was looking at the display where the supply convoy was now moving in clean formation toward the docking bays, and her markings were burning the brightest I had ever seen them. I said, "Does this count as one of the 12 trials?" She looked at me. She looked at me for a long moment, in the way she had looked at me the very first time, in the ceremony hall doorway, with no calculation and no sideways judgment. Just looking. Steady amber eyes and markings, blazing in colors I did not yet have names for. Then she said, "The 12th trial is different." "Tell me," I said. "Not yet," she said. "You will know when it is time." The debrief with Commander Reeve happened the following morning. She had arrived back on station at midnight and had reviewed the full tactical record before our meeting. She sat across from me in the liaison office with the expression of a person who has worked very hard to arrive at the correct professional position on a situation and is delivering it with the control that position requires. She said, "You invoked an alien legal provision to take co-command of the station's defense response." "Yes," I said, "without authorization from regional command." "There was not time for the authorization process," I said. "And the council was moving toward a settlement that would have been operationally costly and would have invited repetition." "Your analysis was correct," she said. "I reviewed the geometry with 3 independent assessors. All 3 confirmed your assessment of the formation gap." A pause. "Where did you learn that tactic?" "A transit station library," I said. "4 years ago. Old Earth naval history." Reeve looked at me for a moment. Then she said, "I'm noting this in your file, as exceptional performance under emergency conditions." Another pause, slightly longer. "And Cole, the memo situation is resolved. Regional Command closed the file this morning." I said thank you, and meant it. She said, "Finish your trials, Sergeant, and try to use the correct doors next time." I did not see Dara that evening. She was in an extended session with the Elder Council, which had apparently decided that the invocation of the champion's right required a formal review and a significant amount of written commentary from everyone present during the crisis. I received a short message from her late that night that said, "The Council has opinions." I told them to keep opinions and strategic insight separate. Tesvan agreed with me. "The session continues tomorrow." I sent back, "Take your time. Eat something." 3 minutes later, I am eating. The cafeteria here has something that claims to be bread. It is approximately bread. I looked at my communicator for a moment, smiling at the ceiling of my quarters. The thing about what had happened in the operations center, not the tactics, but the moment before the order, the 40 seconds in which Dara had looked at me and asked if I trusted my analysis, was that it was the most direct question anyone had ever asked me. Not "What do you think?" Not "Is this a good idea?" Not "Have you considered the risks?" "Do you trust it?" The question had a weight to it because it was not asking about the plan, it was asking about me, whether I believed in what I saw clearly enough to stand behind it when it mattered. I had said yes without hesitation. I had meant it without hesitation, which was something different and larger. The supply convoy docked the following morning, and the station returned to its normal operational pattern with the particular relieved energy of a place that has been under pressure and is now breathing again. People stopped me in corridors to say things. "Good work, and well done, and that was something, Cole." The maintenance supervisor, a woman named Pat, who had worked on the station for 18 years and whom I had always liked because she said exactly what she thought without decoration, stopped me at the junction near Bay 4 and said, "Heard you and the tall one figured it out." "Jointly," I said. "Jointly," she said, in a tone that suggested she found this appropriate. "Good. Come fix the Bay 4 pressure sensor sometime. It's been wrong for a week, and the work order keeps getting deprioritized." The station had its priorities, and they did not pause for crises. Dara emerged from the council sessions on the afternoon of the 3rd day and found me at the outer ring lounge, where I had taken to working on my actual cargo verification backlog because it had piled significantly during the blockade period and was now a problem of its own. She sat across from me and set a ceramic container on the table that turned out to contain something that was approximately tea. She looked, as she always looked after long sessions with the council, like a person who has won every argument and is too principled to be visibly satisfied about it. "The council's formal position," she said, "is that the invocation was procedurally sound, the outcome was favorable, and the precedent it sets is acceptable within established parameters." "That's the formal position," I said. "What's the informal one?" "That I am not as straightforward as they would prefer," she said, "and that you are considerably less predictable than a human security liaison has any right to be." "I'll take that," I said. "I thought you might." She wrapped her primary hands around the container. The markings along her arms were quieter today. The steady, calm pattern that I had learned meant she was settled and thinking, rather than the bright, fast pulse that meant something large was moving through her. "There are 3 trials remaining." "I know." "The 11th is an assessment of endurance," she said. "Not physical endurance, the endurance of commitment under sustained uncertainty. The elder panel will conduct it over the course of 4 days. They will ask you, repeatedly and in different forms, whether you are certain. The answer they are looking for is not confidence, it is honesty." "What do honest answers look like?" "Like whatever is true," she said, "even when what is true is complicated." I nodded. The city of stars outside the viewport was doing what it always did, holding its patient distances while things happened in the small lit stations among them, the things that felt large to the people inside them and did not register to the light traveling between. "Dara," I said. She looked at me. "I'm certain," I said, "in case that's useful to know before the trial." The warmth in her markings moved in one long, slow pulse that started at her collarbone and ran to the tips of her lowest arms. "It is useful," she said quietly. We sat until the cafeteria closed, and then a while longer, because neither of us was ready to stop, and the station did not require us to. The 12th trial has no elder observer. There is no timing requirement, and no formal chamber, and no assessment panel waiting with a written record. It is not conducted on any official day, or in any official place. Every Veltari child learns about it in the way that children learn the most important things, in fragments, through overheard conversations and half-explained traditions, pieced together over years into something that is understood before it is fully articulated. The 12th trial is the choice. After the 11 formal assessments, after the council's deliberations and the candidates' demonstrations and the written records and the ceremonial observations, the potential mate is given 1 night alone. No contact with the candidate they have been bonding with. No council guidance. No family input. A full night to consider, without anyone watching, whether they wish to continue. If they return in the morning, the bonding proceeds. If they do not return, the process ends with no formal consequence and no record that reflects negatively on either party. Every Veltari who has gone through the bonding process, or watched someone go through it, or studied it, or considered it from the outside, knows that the 12th trial is the real one. The 11 that come before it are assessments of quality. The 12th is an assessment of will. I explained this to Marcus on the morning of the day before his night alone, sitting in the outer ring lounge at the table that had become something like ours over the weeks of the courtship. I told him the structure. I told him what was expected and what was not. I told him that there was no protocol for his decision either way, and that I meant that completely. He listened the way he always listened, fully, with the particular quality of attention that I had come to understand was not performed patience, but genuine interest. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You've done this before, watched someone else go through it." "Yes," I said, "my sister, 14 years ago." "How did she handle the night?" "She told me afterward that she spent most of it reading," I said. "And that the answer had been clear for weeks before the night itself. The night was simply the formal space for the answer to be confirmed." He nodded. He looked at the table for a moment, and then out at the viewport, and then back at me. He had a habit of doing this, cycling through the available perspectives before settling on the one he wanted. I found it, as I found most of his habits, oddly endearing. "Is there anything you want me to know?" he asked. "Before the night. Anything you want to say?" I had thought about this. I had thought about it carefully and at length, because I had 22 cycles of practice, thinking carefully and at length about things, and because the last time I had said something to Marcus without first thinking about it carefully, I had asked him to be my mate in a bonding hall in front of 400 people, and while that had gone reasonably well, I had decided not to make it a method. I said, "I want you to know that I am not afraid of either answer." He looked at me. "I was afraid for a long time," I said, "of wanting something this much. I told you that weeks ago, and it was true when I said it. But I have been paying attention since then, and what I have learned is that the fear was about the wanting itself, about the risk of wanting something that did not want me in return. That risk is still present. It is always present in something like this. But I have decided that I prefer it to the alternative, which is being certain of safety at the cost of never finding out." "Finding out what?" he said. "Whether this is what it feels like," I said, "when it is actually right." He looked at me for a long time. "And?" he said. "And it feels like this," I said. He stood up. He walked around the table, and he stood beside me, which in practical terms meant he was standing at my shoulder and looking up at me slightly, which was a physical arrangement that had stopped being awkward for either of us, somewhere around the third week. He looked at me the way he had looked at me from the first moment, directly, without calculation, with the steady, honest interest of a person for whom seeing someone clearly is a natural state rather than a practiced skill. "I'll see you in the morning," he said. I said, "I know." The night was the longest of my life, and I say that as someone who has spent long nights in many kinds of waiting. I did not read. I had tried to read, and my copy of the early expansion policy monograph had sat open on my desk for 40 minutes without my having processed a sentence. I made tea and did not drink it. I stood at the viewport in my quarters on the station's inner ring and looked at the stars, which were exactly where they always were, and expressed no opinion on my situation, which I found less comforting than usual. I was not afraid of Marcus choosing to leave. I had said that to him, and I had meant it. If the night gave him a clear answer, and the answer was no, I would accept it with the same dignity I had brought to every other answer I had been given, and I would be grateful that the trials had been built to protect both people, and not only one of them. I was afraid of something different, and harder to name. The fear that what I had found was so precisely what I had been looking for that believing in it felt like the most dangerous thing I had ever done, not because it might be wrong, but because if it was right, if this was real and solid, and the thing I had been waiting for through 22 cycles of careful, dignified disappointment, then I would have to let it be real. I would have to stop holding the part of myself in reserve that had been in reserve since cycle 8, the part that I had told myself was composure, but that was actually just protection. I stood at the viewport for a long time. I thought about the ceremony hall and the east entrance and the man eating a protein bar in the wrong room with honest eyes. I thought about the hall of questions and 3 days of elder debate over an answer that was different but not wrong. I thought about the outer ring lounge and 2 hours of conversation that moved so easily it felt like something established rather than something new. I thought about the operations center and the tactical display and the 40 seconds before the order when he had asked me if I trusted his analysis, and I had known, in that moment, that I trusted him entirely. I thought, I have spent a very long time being careful. I thought, I would like to stop being quite so careful now. I stood at the viewport until the station's time system moved into morning hours, and then I went to sleep, which was a thing I had not expected to be able to do, and which happened easily and quickly, in the way that things happen when a decision that has already been made is simply waiting for the body to catch up. I was at the junction outside the Elder Council's formal reception chamber at 07:02 the following morning, 14 minutes before the time I had specified to Marcus. He was already there. He was sitting on the bench outside the chamber door with a travel cup of something that was approximately coffee and a small, crumpled piece of paper in his other hand that he was not looking at. He was looking down the corridor in the direction of the outer ring, with that calm, settled expression that meant he was not waiting nervously, but simply waiting, the way a person waits for something they have already decided on. He looked up when he heard my footsteps. He stood. I walked the length of the corridor toward him, which was not as long as the ceremonial floor of the bonding hall, but which had its own kind of weight. He watched me come, and when I stopped in front of him, he did not say anything immediately, which was something I had learned about him. He did not speak before he was ready, and he was never not ready when he did. He said, in Veltari, which he had been studying for weeks without telling me, and which he spoke with an accent that was careful and committed, in the way of someone who has learned a language because it matters to them and not because it is convenient. I chose you in the first cycle. I was just waiting for the paperwork. The markings along my arms and neck and collarbone, which I had spent the better part of my adult life learning to control, went entirely beyond my management. They blazed, the bloom of beginning, running bright and continuous from my collarbone to the ends of all four arms, the involuntary color of something too large for the body to hold quietly. I had pressed my hand over it once, weeks ago, in the outer ring lounge when he had called it beautiful. I did not press my hand over it now. He smiled, the kind of smile that moves through the eyes first. "That's the one," he said, in his own language. "I've been hoping to get that one." The ceremony was small. We had both agreed on small, for different reasons that turned out to be the same reason. Neither of us had any interest in the version of this that was about an audience. The bonding hall was available, and Elder Tesfan offered to officiate, and my sister arrived from her station the night before and spent the evening being extremely composed in a way that I knew meant she was very moved and would absolutely cry during the ceremony and was preparing to pretend otherwise. Marcus's brother sent a long message that arrived at 2300 the night before and that Marcus read to me in the lounge. It said, among other things, that he was sorry he could not make it from this distance, that he had told their mother and she had cried twice, and then asked very practical questions about Veltari dietary customs, that Marcus had always found the unusual doors, and that he hoped this particular one led somewhere good. We thought it probably did. Tesfan asked the questions with the precision of someone who has asked them many times and still finds them worth asking carefully. My sister stood to my left and held both of my secondary hands in hers, which was a traditional position and which I was grateful for, not because I needed steadying, but because she wanted to be close and I wanted her close. Marcus stood in front of me in his best uniform, which he had actually pressed for the occasion, and answered every question with the same quality he had brought to every trial, directly, honestly, without performing certainty he did not have, and without concealing certainty he did. When Tesfan asked him, as the final question of the ceremony, whether he understood the full scope of what he was choosing and the significance of the commitment he was making, the formal question that tradition required, he said, "An 8-foot genius with 4 arms who saved a space station and still can't figure out how to work the coffee dispenser. Yeah. I think I'll manage." Tesfan, who had not smiled visibly during any official function in the 32 years since I had known her, smiled. My sister made a sound that she immediately converted into a very convincing cough. My markings did exactly as they pleased, which was to go brilliant and warm and entirely unconcerned with my composure. That was the morning. In the years that came after, the story moved ahead of us in the way that stories do, outpacing the people at the center of them, becoming something larger than what actually happened. There were articles written about the bonding. 3 different academics published papers on the champion's right invocation and its legal implications. A junior diplomat from the Veltari Foreign Council used the blockade resolution as a case study in her training materials. a station on the outer ring named a docking bay after the tactical maneuver, which Marcus found alternately gratifying and embarrassing depending on the day. We were given a joint assignment the following year, which I had negotiated through channels I understood well, and which Marcus had been informed about one morning with his coffee as a completed fact rather than a question, which he accepted with the philosophy that information delivered over coffee was generally information he would come around to agreeing with eventually. He did. He always did. Now I sit in the observation deck of our ship, in the particular quiet of a late watch, when the rest of the crew is asleep, and the stars outside the viewport are doing their patient, eternal work. Marcus is at the small work table across the room, teaching our daughter a card trick. She is 6 years old, with amber eyes that came from me, and a particular kind of focused, delighted stubbornness that came from both of us, and that I anticipate will cause us significant difficulty in approximately 8 years when she is old enough to direct it fully. She has learned the card trick twice already, and she is learning it a third time because she wants to be sure she can do it from any starting position, which is not how card tricks are generally taught, but is how she does things. Marcus is explaining patiently, which is how he explains everything, and she is listening with the particular quality of attention that I recognize from her father and that I hope she keeps for the rest of her life. I watch them for a while. Then I open my notes file and write a sentence that I have been thinking about for some time. No one chose me, so I chose myself, and then I chose him. The galaxy called it scandalous. I call it Thursday. I close the file. I look out at the stars. Marcus says something to our daughter in a low voice, and she laughs, suddenly and fully, the laugh of a child who has found something genuinely funny and has not yet learned to moderate her response to delight. I think there are 22 cycles behind me and an unknown number ahead, and the thing that most surprises me, still, after all of it, is how uncomplicated the good parts have turned out to be. The stars are exactly where they always are. I am exactly where I chose to be. There are moments in the life of a person who has arrived somewhere they wanted to be, where the past loses its bitterness and becomes simply information, not erased, not forgiven in the complicated way that requires a ceremony of its own. Just made flat and factual, the way a battle becomes a historical event when enough time has passed. Still real, still worth understanding, but no longer carrying the weight of a wound. 22 cycles had been 22 cycles. They had been painful in the specific way of something that happens over a long time with no clear resolution in sight, the kind of pain that is less dramatic than a sudden thing but more wearing, because it does not peak and subside but simply continues, requiring the person inside it to manage it consistently without showing the management too plainly to anyone watching. I had managed it. I had stood straight on every platform and kept my composure in every corridor and corrected elder translations when they were wrong and offered opinions when they were relevant, and been exactly as much of myself as I was capable of being, even when being that much of myself was apparently the thing that made me, as the form rejections had put it in their careful language, a complicated match. I did not regret any of it. This was something I had tested honestly, in the private way that I tested things that mattered, and the result was consistent. I did not regret being who I was during those years. I regretted the loneliness. I did not regret myself. Marcus had understood this without being told, not because he had intuited it in some dramatic way, but because he was the kind of person who paid attention and was honest about what he saw, and what he saw was a person who was exactly who she was, consistently, under all kinds of pressure and observation. He had said once, in the plain-spoken way he said the things that mattered, "You never moved the line, I watched for it. You never changed who you were to make it easier for someone to pick you." And then, after a pause, I find that one of the most admirable things I have ever seen. I had said, it was not a strategy, it was simply who I was. He had said, "I know, that's what makes it admirable. Our daughter's name is Sarah. She has, In addition to the amber eyes and the focused stubbornness, a talent for navigation that she displays by consistently finding the most efficient routes through any space she occupies, whether that space is a ship corridor or an argument or a particularly complicated mathematical problem that her teacher sends home and that she solves in approximately 1/3 the expected time and then asks for more. She is patient with people she likes and politely direct with everyone else. She asks questions the way her father asks questions, which is to say that she asks them because she actually wants the answers and will follow up if the first answer is incomplete. I find her astonishing. I suspect I am not the most objective observer. Marcus finished the card trick lesson on the 3rd pass, at which point Sarah declared herself proficient and immediately asked what the 4th pass would add. He told her that the 4th pass was practice, which she considered for a moment before deciding was acceptable. He sent her to bed with the particular easy authority of a person who is not performing parental firmness but simply expressing a practical view, and she went with the particular easy compliance of a child who respects the reasoning even when she has not been given all of it. He came to sit beside me on the observation deck. He brought his approximately coffee, which was a compromise blend he had developed after 2 years of working with the ship's nutrition system, because actual coffee at this distance from Earth was either unavailable or prohibitively expensive, and which he consumed every evening with the contented acceptance of a person who has learned the difference between what he preferred and what was available, and has decided the gap is not worth being unhappy about. I moved slightly to the left, which was a small adjustment but a habitual one, the kind of thing 2 people develop without discussing after years of occupying the same spaces. He settled into the adjusted arrangement the way he settled into everything, without ceremony, as though it were simply the correct position and always had been. Outside the viewport, a long-range merchant convoy was moving through the corridor, 3 passages to our south, its running lights visible as a loose string of small bright points against the dark. Marcus watched it for a moment. "She's going to be better at card tricks than I am within a month," he said. 2 weeks, I said. He made a sound of mild resignation. "Probably 2 weeks," he agreed. He drank his approximately coffee. "She asked me today where we were going next." "What did you tell her?" "That we were going where the assignment took us," he said. "And that, wherever that was, we would figure it out when we got there." "She accepted that?" "She said that was not a specific answer, and that she would like coordinates." He smiled into his cup. "I told her patience was a navigational tool. She wrote it down." I looked at him. The observation deck lighting was low at this hour, and in it, he looked much as he had always looked to me. Not younger or older than the version of him in the bonding hall, or the operations center, or the outer ring lounge, but simply himself, continuous and unperformed. The hair was still not entirely disciplined. His expression in repose was still the expression of a person who finds the world generally worth paying attention to. I said, "Marcus." "Yes," he said. "I want to tell you something that I have thought about for some time, but have not said." He turned toward me. His expression shifted into the particular attentiveness that meant he was listening fully, with everything put aside. "When I asked you in the bonding hall," I said, "I was afraid. Not of your answer. I was afraid of what asking meant, that I had stopped managing the wanting and started acting from it. That I had become visible in a way that I could not control." I paused. "I have spent years since then thinking about what would have happened if you had said no." "What would have happened?" he said. "I would have walked back to the platform," I said, "and stood straight. And been measured and composed and entirely fine in every external way, and I would have gone home and been privately devastated, and then I would have rebuilt the composure and maintained it, because that was what I knew how to do." I looked at him, but I would not have been the same. Something would have closed. He was quiet. "I am telling you this," I said, "because I do not think I have ever made fully clear what it cost to ask, and because you have spent 6 years being someone who made the asking worth it, and I want you to know that I know that, and that I am not someone who takes a thing like that for granted. Marcus set down his cup. He looked at me for a moment in the careful, honest way he looked at things when he was finding the most precise response available. Then he said, "Dara, I knew what it cost. I knew that first morning, at the bench outside the council chamber, when you walked down the corridor toward me. You walked exactly the way you walked at the ceremony, straight, not hurrying, taking up your full space. And I thought, she has been straight and unhurried for 22 years of being told she is too much. She is doing it again right now. For me." He picked his cup back up. "I have never for one day," he said, "not known what I was given." The stars outside the viewport maintained their patient distances. The merchant convoy moved slowly through Corridor 3, its lights small and steady and going somewhere specific. I put my primary hand over his, where it rested on the seat between us. He turned his hand over and held mine, which was something we had done since the outer ring lounge on approximately the 14th day, and had continued doing because it required no explanation and needed none. We sat in the observation deck while the ship moved through its quiet night cycle, and the stars held their distances, and our daughter slept in her cabin, probably dreaming about coordinates and card tricks and the fourth pass of practice. I thought, no one chose me. I thought, so I chose. I thought, it turns out that choosing is the whole thing. The waiting and the hoping and the careful composure are the frame around it. But the choosing is the center, and everything else is just the space around the center, and the space around it is very large and very full and very good. Marcus refilled his approximately coffee from the small container on the side table and offered the container to me in the wordless way he offered things, and I declined in the wordless way I declined things, and neither of us needed to say anything about it because we had spent 6 years building the particular vocabulary of two people who know each other well enough that most of the important things have already been said and the rest can wait. We stayed there until the late watch ended and the ship shifted into morning cycle and the viewport filled with the first faint light of a star system we had not yet named for ourselves. Sarah found us there at 06:30, fully awake and carrying a piece of paper on which she had worked out a card sequence she wanted to demonstrate. Marcus looked at me. I looked at him. We both looked at our daughter, who was 7 months from 7 years old and had not yet been taught that 06:30 was an unreasonable time to present new work, and who I suspected would never fully learn it. "Show us," Marcus said. She showed us. It was perfect.